Well, a few weeks ago, we had some of our closest friends that we've been friends with for 17 years now and counting. They came and they visited us here in Charlotte. They live in Kansas City, and their family was on spring break, and they came and spent some time with us. And we see them a couple of times a year. They're those kinds of friends. They're the kind of friends who, like, our kids are the same age. We're in the same season of life together. And in fact, when we lived in Tulsa, Becky and I just got married. We moved to Tulsa, took a position there at a church, and they were in this church. And my friend, he was a resident. He was training to be a doctor, and he was going through the residency program there at one of the hospitals in Tulsa. And he and his wife and Becky and I, we just became super close friends. They're the type of friends who, like, when Becky was pregnant with Landon, and we were in the hospital, doing the labor thing, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, we were walking through the hospital, and who showed up but our friends Mike and Bethany. Bethany, who was, at the time we didn't know, but like just 3 weeks from there, she was going to give birth to her first children. So she was walking through the hospital with us at 3 o'clock in the morning as we were going through that whole process. They're the kind of friends, like, when we were there, I would go and I'd eat lunch with Mike at the hospital in the hospital cafeteria, or when he was on call, they have rooms at the hospital for people who have to stay there overnight and they're on call. And I would go and watch, we're in the middle of March Madness. I can still remember going and watching basketball in the on-call room with him, just hanging out there. We're those kinds of friends. We're the kind of friends who just a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, when I had an accident and injured my hand and had to have an emergency surgery, and I never had surgery before like that in my life, and this was in Nebraska, and we got there at the hospital, and they took me into surgery, and then I had to stay there overnight. Never stayed in the hospital overnight ever in my life. And there was Mike, who drove 4 hours from Kansas City just to be in the hospital room with me so that Becky and the kids could go home 45 minutes away. They're the kinds of friends who 6 months ago, when Becky had her episode and had a seizure, I could call Bethany, and in 2 days, Bethany was on a plane and she was here. Those kinds of friends who know you, know everything about you, and will do anything to be there for you. They're what I would call authentic, real friends. Friends who care about you. Friends who know the real you. And we're in this series called The Authentic Jesus, or Authentic Jesus, where we're looking at these I am statements about Jesus from the New Testament book of John. And these statements where Jesus was trying to help his own people to know him, to know the authentic him, to see the real him, and to try to help them understand that he was the Messiah, or the King who was to come and to make the world right again. And as we talked about last week, Jesus used language and imagery that they would have been really familiar with, that described who the Messiah or this King was supposed to be, what he was supposed to look like, what he was supposed to do. And Jesus even begins to draw this concept of this King also as being the very God they have worshiped from their very beginning. That their God has now stepped into their world and clothed himself in their humanity. And last week's, the I am statement that we had from Jesus that we looked at, found in John chapter 10, Jesus once again used the imagery of what the people would have used to understand the relationship that God had with them. One where God was seen as the great shepherd, the good shepherd who knows his sheep intimately. And remember, Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. This is John 10, verses 14 through 15. I am the good shepherd. I know my own sheep, and they know me, just as my Father knows me, and I know the Father. So I sacrifice my life for the sheep. Another translation for that word, good, would be beautiful. Because there is something that is so beautiful and attractive about not just who Jesus is, but also how Jesus reveals who he is, right? That he is the one true shepherd who sacrifices his life for the sheep. that God the Father has given him, the Son of God, the authority over life itself. In John 10, Jesus said, the Father loves me because I sacrificed my life so I may take it back again. No one can take my life from me. I sacrifice it voluntarily, for I have the authority to lay it down when I want to, and also to take it up again. For this is what my Father has commanded. Jesus is saying, look, what I have to do to set things straight, what I have to do for people I love will cost me greatly. He knows this. He wants his people to know this. He wants us to know this. And Jesus is saying that the cost will be worth it because the price he will pay with his life, it's like an investment. It will come back even more powerful than before. And it will be his choice. That's what Jesus says, that this good shepherd that he is will do. So this takes us to the next I am statement that we're going to look at today, found in chapter 11 of the New Testament book of John, John chapter 11, one where we see just how much Jesus does love his own. The authentic Jesus had authentic friends. I love that, right? I think sometimes we forget the dynamics of Jesus' relationships. Jesus has plenty of enemies. The Pharisees, the religious leaders, Rome. There's the people who he heals and helps, right? Many of them become his followers. We think of the disciples. No doubt they were his friends. There's no doubt they were close to each other. But Jesus had friends even beyond just those 12 guys that followed him around. And we see in this story in John chapter 11, there are these two sisters and this brother of theirs, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, who are very close friends of Jesus. I imagine they had spent time together over the years. Mary and Martha are the ones who had a dinner party at their house in the book of Luke chapter 10. And in the story, while Jesus was visiting in that story, right? And while he was visiting them, Mary was hanging out in the family room, listening to Jesus teach and talk. And Martha was busy getting a big dinner ready. And Martha gets a bit annoyed with her sister for sitting there, listening to Jesus while she's working her head off, getting ready for the dinner. But they are close friends. They've done life together. They've been there with each other. And in that story, when Jesus is at dinner at their house, Jesus has to help Martha slow down and see the bigger picture. Well, here in this chapter 11, Mary and Martha's brother Lazarus, who was a close friend of Jesus, had become sick. So Mary and Martha send word to Jesus, who was at that time about a day's walking distance away from them, that Lazarus was very, very ill. And listen to this, when they send word to Jesus, when they send a message, a letter to Jesus telling him about the situation, the message to Jesus is, Lord, your dear friend is sick. Some of the translations also say, Lord, the one you love is sick. This is a close friend that Jesus loved deeply. And Jesus responds when he receives word about Lazarus. He responds. It says, but when Jesus heard about it, he said, this is 11:4, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. Now, there's a really very good chance that at least by the time this message had gotten to Jesus, Lazarus was actually dead. Which is really interesting when Jesus says Lazarus' illness won't end in death. And maybe the disciples thought, oh, here's another instance where Jesus is going to heal somebody from a distance, and we don't really have to do anything about it. But this next phrase here, where Jesus says there in John 11:4, no, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. You know what that reminds me of? That reminds me of, we've been talking about the blind man who had been born blind from birth, right? And when the disciples saw that blind man, this was back in John 9, they saw the blind man on the side of the road, and they asked Jesus, has this man been blind because was he born blind because of the sins of his parents? And Jesus is like, no, he hasn't been born blind because of the sins of his parents. It's so that the power of God can be seen in him. In other words, there's an opportunity here Jesus has for people to see who Jesus really is. Because when God's presence is revealed in what Jesus does, it reveals who Jesus is. This is why the people and the religious leaders have all these debates, right? Every time Jesus does something that can only come from God, every time something good happens like a healing, everybody knows that anything good like that can only happen because of God. And it's very possible that even Jesus, his waiting to go to where Lazarus was, his waiting was part of how he wanted to be very clear what he's going to do is totally from God. See, the way they saw death at the time, they had this idea that after someone appears to have died, after one day, they may not be totally dead. That after 2 days, they may not be totally dead. But after 3 days, it was agreed by most people at that time that their loved one or their friend really isn't coming back. And so when Jesus decides to head back, it's past the time when Lazarus might still have a little bit left in him. It's also interesting because this area where Mary and Martha and Lazarus lived is not too far from Jerusalem. It was a hostile environment for Jesus and his followers, because not too long before this, Jesus and his followers had been there, and they had gotten some stuff riled up, and people wanted them dead. People wanted to kill them. People wanted to stone them to death. And when Jesus finally decides to go back, his disciples are at first kind of like, whoa, Jesus, hang on a minute. Do you know how dangerous it is? Do you know if you go back, they might actually kill you this time? And Thomas even says, when he finally musters up the courage, let's all go together and die. It's like, this is our moment, our call to arms. Funny note, in this story that we're going to be diving into here about Lazarus, this is the last time that the disciples are mentioned. Isn't that interesting? The last time. So let's pick it up here. This is John 11, starting in verse 17. It says, when Jesus arrived at Bethany, this is that town that's outside of Jerusalem where Lazarus, Mary, and Martha lived. He was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. Bethany was only a few miles down the road from Jerusalem, and many of the people had come to console Martha and Mary in their loss. When Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him. Martha is on top of it. But Mary stayed in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. Yes, Martha said, he will rise when everyone else rises at the last day. And Jesus told her, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. And everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this, Martha? Yes, Lord, she told him. I have always believed you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world from God. So Lazarus, he's been in this grave for 4 days, right? There is no doubt that Lazarus is really dead. And as is their custom, they have a period of mourning, and the community even participates in the mourning process with Mary and Martha. And so Martha hears that Jesus is just outside the village, and you know, Martha's got to be out there and go, and she's got some questions for Jesus. She's got some things that she needs to get straight with her friend. I mean, just days ago, this man, her friend, healed a man born blind. There's all kinds of instances where Jesus healed somebody, even people who were very near death. All he would have had to do was say the word. All he would have had to do was pray a prayer, and this could have been stopped. Their hearts would not be shattered into a million pieces. And so Martha runs out to Jesus, and here's what she says. Let's go over that again. Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. This is a statement right here, right? This is a sister who is grief-stricken to the core. If only, then things would have been different. But here's the deal about Martha. I love this about Martha. She doesn't stop here with that statement. I've read a lot of stuff that focuses on that statement, if only. If only Jesus had done this, if only Jesus had done that. And sure, we can all identify with that if only feeling. But the next thing that Martha says also reveals something about Martha. In verse 22 again, she says, but even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask. See, Martha has been paying attention. Martha knows that what Jesus does only comes from his connection to God. She knows that somehow, in some way, when Jesus prays, God responds. And to be honest, she's desperate, right? She is willing to throw one more thing against the wall and see if just maybe it will stick. Even now. Even now. And so Jesus responds to her by saying, your brother will rise again. And Martha says, yes, he'll rise, just like everyone else will rise. And Jesus tries to clue Martha into what's about to happen. And to understand Martha's response, it's important to recognize that though there were some Jewish people who did not believe in the resurrection, particularly a group called the Sadducees, many in the Jewish faith did believe, including Jesus, in the resurrection. They would have heard and studied about it through the Hebrew scriptures from books like Daniel, where it says in Daniel 12:2, many of those whose bodies lie dead and buried will rise up, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting disgrace. Or from the prophet Isaiah in chapters 65 and 66, this would have been what they would have seen as the age to come, right? They understand that they are living in the age of now, and there's an age to come. And one of my favorite theologians, I love what N.T. Wright says about this. They would have had a vision of a new heaven and new earth, God's whole new earth, new world, a world like ours, only with its beauty and power enhanced, and its pain and ugliness and grief abolished. Within that new world, they believed all God's people from ancient times to the present would be given new bodies to share and relish the life of new creation. This is what Martha would have thought. This is what she would have thought Jesus was talking about. And she was saying in complete agreement, of course, I agree. They probably have had conversations about this. Her and Mary and Martha and even Lazarus have probably had dinner conversations about all of this. And they all agreed. This is what they believed. And see, the Jewish view of the Messiah would be that the Messiah or the Christ, this Jewish king, out of the line of their most famous King David, he would be like Moses and lead them out of their oppression. He would be like the great Old Testament prophet Elijah. And this Messiah would begin to usher in a new age. Like the new heaven and earth that is to come, their Messiah would be ushering it in. He would be bringing them out of the old and into the new. This is what they believe the Messiah would do. And so Jesus is trying to get her to see along these lines and even more. Jesus tells her that the future she's waiting on is arriving right in front of her. It's like Jesus is saying, the future that you are hoping for, the life that you are so longing for, the life you are desperate for, is breaking through this evil age, and change is beginning. The old and new are colliding. They're colliding, and the collision point, the intersection, is Jesus himself. That's why Jesus says next, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never die. Now, this is the I am statement, right? And Martha's response is the central piece of this whole story, this whole experience. Jesus is telling her that he is the life. He is the resurrection that she hopes for. He is bringing what she thought could only happen in the distant future. He's bringing it into the here and now. But here's the deal. Jesus is only the beginning of this transition. Jesus sets in motion what God is wanting to do. And I have a graphic up here just to kind of help you visualize it, right? The new heaven and earth, and Jesus is bursting on the scenes, and we are in the current age, and we still are. Jesus is that intersection, and Jesus is asking Martha, do you believe that this is who I am? And the most amazing thing happens. This amazing woman who's been swimming in her grief for days, she responds, yes, Lord, she told him. I have always believed you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world from God. Do you hear what she just said? Listen, Martha had faith to believe in who Jesus was before anything actually changed. Lazarus is not alive yet. He's still in the grave. It's still been 4 days, and yet she still believes in Jesus. Even though Jesus didn't show up exactly when she wanted him to. Even though Jesus just gives this strange answer to her. I mean, we all have the luxury of looking back on this story and knowing where it goes. But Martha, in that moment, she doesn't know where this is going. And she chooses to believe. And so Martha runs and gets Mary, her sister. And everyone's there comforting Mary. And there's even this profession where people come in and they're professional mourners who are there to mourn with the family and to help them. A whole crowd of them. And they see Mary leave and go out. And they think her and Martha are going down to the tomb to mourn some more. And the atmosphere is thick with grief. Thick with grief. I tell you, I have seen a lot of death over the years. I have seen young and old. I have been there when the last breath is taken. I have been there when the casket is closed. I have seen families so grief-stricken in their loss. I can tell you what an atmosphere of grief feels like. And Mary finally makes it to where Jesus is. It says in John 11:32, when Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, here it is, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. There's that if only again. Now Jesus has heard it from his friend Mary. And this time the grief touches the heart of God in a new way. Here's what Jesus did next. When Jesus saw her, picking up in 33, when Jesus saw her weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. Where have you put him? He asked them. They told him, Lord, come and see. Then Jesus wept. The people who were standing by said, see how much he loved him. But some said, this man healed a blind man. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying? It's interesting, that first part, Jesus is angry, right? Death had claimed another victim, and this time it was his dear friend that he loved so much. This time, even his heart was so broken. Listen, God is moved by our sorrow and angered by the injustice of death. Do you hear me? God is moved. I've been reading a book about lynchings that have happened in the 1900s here in America at the hands of mobs. Some of the most horrendous, horrible things that happen to people just because the color of their skin. I think of families, the moms and dad in Ukraine, the Russian mom and dads whose sons and daughters were sent off to war, and they'll never see them again. I'm telling you something, I do believe there will be a day of reckoning. I do believe that evil will not have the last word. I do believe that a new heaven and a new earth will one day fully be here. But until that day, while we live in this already but not yet, we need to know that God hurts with us, that God is on the side of the oppressed. And every time we sit down with someone who is in the midst of their sorrow, every time we cry with someone, I think of my friends who showed up, Bethany, when she showed up. Every time we do this, every time we offer a shoulder for someone to lean on, every time we pray, every time we sing, for those who have no voice, we can be a reminder of a God who is in the midst of the sorrow with them. Let's keep going. Verse 39. Jesus says, roll the stone aside. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, Lord, he has been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible. And Jesus responded, didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe? So they rolled the stone aside, and then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me. But I said it out loud for the sake of all those people standing here, so that they will believe you sent me. Then Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in headcloth. And Jesus told them, unwrap him, let him go. Jesus reveals a sign that points to who he is. That he has the authority to bring life, that life can conquer death in Jesus' name. The main point isn't really about Jesus bringing a person back to life physically. That's not a bad point. It's pretty impressive, but that's not the purpose. This was meant to be a sign revealing who Jesus really is, revealing exactly what Jesus means when Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Not just something that will only happen way off in the distant future, but we can have this resurrection future right now in our current reality because Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Power to overcome sin and evil that leads to death. I love what my friend Jess Mittendorf says. He says, death is vulnerable before Jesus, not because of what Jesus can do. Death must release its grip on Lazarus because of who Jesus is. I'm going to add one more thought here. You know, Lazarus, being this good friend of Jesus, Lazarus knew the voice of his friend who called him out of the grip of death. I am convinced that this love that Jesus had for Lazarus is available to every one of us. I am convinced that this love Jesus had for Lazarus, he also has for our friends, our families, our classmates, our co-workers, our neighbors, people who don't look like us or share the same view of life or the world. I am convinced that Jesus loves this much. Because Jesus knew, here's the deal. Jesus knew that by calling Lazarus out of the grave, it was going to cost him. Jesus knew that it was going to reveal something that was going to shock some people. It was going to threaten some people. They were going to see how different Jesus was. He knew that it would mean he would suffer. He knew that it was going to draw his death even closer. But I'll tell you what else he knew. He knew that he was the resurrection and the life. He knew that he would live even after dying. Jesus knew that. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes? I want us to move into a time of reflection. I want to offer you the chance today, if you don't know this Jesus, to hear him calling you, to receive this resurrection life inside of you today, to receive this hope. Maybe today you need to think about the ways that you can bring this resurrection power into the world where you live. See, when we receive Jesus, when we say yes to Jesus, when we say yes to the life he offers us, we carry around inside of us the hope of this resurrection power. The future is bursting in to our current reality.